Creche, a representation of the infant Jesus in a manger, usually surrounded by Mary and Joseph, and also shepherds, animals, and wise men. The creche has been displayed at Christmas in churches since the 13th century, when St. Francis of Assisi instituted the custom. St. Mary Catholic Community commissioned the carving of a wooden creche by a local Helena craftsman and artist, of which our parish is extremely proud. D. King, a longtime parishioner of St. Mary's, has been involved with our creche since its inception in 1989. Dee is here with us to tell us the story of St. Mary's Christmas Creche.
My name is Dee King, and I was a member of the liturgy committee, and that is where our creche really began, was in the, from the liturgy core team. I happened to know Scott Walter, and I had seen his work at the, it used to be called Electrum, and there were people that had special kind of crafts that made them and sold them there, and that's where I met Scott, and I bought some toys for my grandkids from him that were carved out of wood, and I suggested that I contact him, and they all thought it was a good idea.
In 1989, D. King contacted me for the St. Mary's Catholic Church about carving a nativity. They had decided they were ready for a new nativity, and I had just recently been to Germany and decided that I was excited about figure carving. I was fairly young, but in 87 I had seen a variety of carvings in Germany by Tilman Riemenschneider and Wiet Stoss, and so I wasn't sure I could do it, but I asked Dee if I could carve a figure just as a demonstration piece and see if they would approve it. And so I started off to carve Joseph out of a block roughly 8 by 6 by 24 inches tall. The wood had come to me at a recent time, recently before that request for the pieces. I had bought it at an auction at the Anselmo mine yard at the carpenter shop there in Butte, and some of it actually had the year 1916 written on it. It had been sitting in storage for all those years. This is a piece of it. It's yellow poplar. It's fairly dense, but it's really evenly grained, and actually it's just a very sweet carving wood. Before I actually started carving the pieces, I would draw them on the blocks, and these are some outline pieces that I had left over from some of the figures. Draw them on the blocks and saw them on the bandsaw to give me a basic block. It's called wasting the carving down, but it makes the time involved in carving much less. So I sawed them in the profile that was the most useful to me first, and then I would redraw on the block the other way and saw as much as I could that way. So then I ended up with a rough figure, and then just began to cut away the corners and round the blocks.
He did some research, so before he came to our meeting to present this Joseph, he had done some research, and so he said that he could do the 3 pieces and have them finished by Christmas. He told Ed it would be $1,000 for the 3 pieces. So Ed was kind of concerned as to how maybe we were going to pay for this. So I asked for his permission to see if I could collect the money. I said, I know that I can collect $100 from 9 more people that will come up with $1,000, and that's how that first one of the 3 pieces got paid. St. Joseph is holding a an oil lamp, and because at that time tin had not been invented. Often you see Joseph with a kind of a funny looking metal lantern, but that isn't the true thing because it wasn't invented at that time. And something else that I did want to mention is that the first animals that we got were the donkey and the ox. We sort of let Scott decide what he wanted to do. He knew what we needed, he knew what made up the creche, and so he knew what kind of people or what kind of animals would have to be part of it. And so he brought another shepherd, and Sister Mary Jo, whom we all love dearly, and who could imagine her, I'll just never forget her saying this. And she looked at him with a smile on her face, and her eyeballs kind of rolled, and she said, "Oh, another man." And so the next year, he brought the innkeeper's daughter, and the innkeeper's daughter is the one that has a tray of food in her hand.
There was a young sister, a petite lady, and she came into one of the meetings about the Nativity, and she said, "You know what always frustrates me about the Nativity? It's always Mary and Joseph and the guys." And so as a result, I carved the figure of the innkeeper's daughter bringing the gift of water and a cloth. This is the roughed out outline of her figure. And I just thought that was a good description. You got to have Mary and Joseph and the guys.
From then on, he just brought different pieces and more pieces, and we have the crippled shepherd. We have the astrologers, or they're also called at that time astrologers and astronomers, because they did both. They followed the star because they were stargazers. So I guess those three pieces must have come together, and I don't know that we got any more of the sheep or shepherds after that. And the camel is the very last piece that we that he did. Another feature is there's a very small lamb that is there. It was a gift to Sister Pat when she was leaving, and it was called Pat's Lamb, and so she took it with her, but before the first Christmas she brought it back and said that her lamb belonged here with the creche with the rest of them. So we have Pat's Lamb is a great addition to our creche. And one of the other unusual shepherds that we have is the crippled shepherd. He has one leg out, and you can see that he is crippled, and he's dressed a little differently than some of the other shepherds.
You can still see a few of my lines perhaps here. The outline of the figure in one direction, usually the most complex direction. And then I would saw that block out with the bandsaw, which is the perimeter that you see here. And after I had sawn the block in that direction, I would turn it 90 degrees and cut as best I could the form of the figure in the other direction, which gave me basically a square, rectilinear cross-section of the figure. And then it involved a lot of wasting of material on the edges and corners. And even some of that I was able to do on the bandsaw. I would take a piece like this and balance it and bevel the part to remove some of the material to get the form. On the figure of the crippled man, I had decided that he would wear a tunic. And you can see the corner of the tunic here and then where it comes across his arm. And in the process of carving that, what I had to do was separate that line. So I would make a deep cut along that line. and then I would begin removing the material to that line. And where the figure was more radiused or cut away, I would relatively rapidly remove that material by basically chipping away and recutting repeatedly. Now this is a place where in more classical European carving they would use a mallet and they would drive that chisel deeply in there. But I guess I was also a little timid and I tended to work my way gradually into the form that I was looking for. There's quite a lot of force involved, and the slips are extremely dangerous. It's not unusual for me to bleed some. I was putting in detail like hair, and I have tiny little V gouges that allowed me to cut a very detailed groove and steer them rapidly in differing directions. Once I had all that detail carved, I sanded the figures. Now this is another thing that the classic European carvers rarely did, and I think it in some respects represents my relative lack of knowledge, because in Europe they typically carve all the forms as close as possible with the chisel edges. I had a tradition of sanding my toy work already, and I actually kind of like that polish kind of finish, and so I would sand the work extensively using various grades of sandpaper, and my thumb the paper formed around my thumb, and then I found that the yellow poplar actually had a little bit of a fuzziness to it, and so I would sand the figures, and then I would oil them with the finish that I would use, and then I would resand them with the oil on, because I could build up a hardness, a polish on the surface that way. So some of them were sanded and oiled multiple times. I even borrowed the pieces back years later and added additional sandings. It seems like figurative work is really quite oriented toward speed at the start and a slowing down process. I also tended to find it was a little difficult to decide when you were done. As you can see, this very crude, but you can start to see how the shape is appearing in the hand. And bringing the wrist into the hand, you start to separate that volume again. This particular piece has a fine check in it here. This is something I had to watch for quite a bit in the figures, and if you leave that kind of a check in the piece, it's going to crack. That's part of the reason this particular piece has been cut off the side of the block that the figure was made from. Most of the figures in the Nativity are carved from a single piece of wood. There's a few exceptions, but only because the volume of the ox and the camel were particularly large. There was just no way to get that scale of material in one piece. It took a lot of time to get down to where I could start carving the features and the details that I wanted to do. Then was the fun part.